I am here to talk today about organizational culture. It is a big and hairy topic that we could all, you're all thinking people who think about big and hairy topics all day, so you're no stranger to the big and hairy. If you give me the next hour of your time and attention, I think I can tell you some things that I know that will be useful to you as knowledge management professionals related to the topic of culture. I was really flattered that I was asked to come here today. I know there's a lot of people with amazing kinds of experiences and background, like Jane is a librarian. You all are smart and curious and thinking people with whom I presume I have a lot in common, because you are all professionals who have chosen to focus on a topic that is messy, and there is not yet a definitive framework for how to make it work. So I kind of presume that we have that in common. But I'm actually making a couple of assumptions about you. I also assume that if you came at 8:30 in the morning to hear someone talk about culture and you're interested in knowledge management, by definition, you're curious and willing to kind of move into a space where you're not, about things of which you're not certain. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'm starting with my assumptions about you guys. And I actually wanted to start with a little bit of a contest. So we're gonna do that. I've designed a contest for you guys here today. And the contest is based on a couple of assumptions that I made about you. The first one is that core trait of curiosity. I'm presuming that everybody who's looking at me is curious. I'm also presuming, based on people I know in knowledge management as a field, that you enjoy connecting with a lot of other people, but it's not necessarily your first instinct. I'm presuming I might have a lot of introverts in the room, but I could be wrong, and I kind of will see. And the third assumption I'm making is that you are by nature competitive because you're important enough to be in this room. Someone in your day job said, you can spend these days in Washington, D.C., having these lovely experiences and learning. So I'm making that assumption about you guys also as curious and competitive people. And finally, I'm also presuming that, yes, you're here to hear me and the other speakers speak, but you're also here to connect and meet each other. Because you could watch me talk online, right? You could get this experience in some other kind of way. So based on these assumptions, here's the contest I have for you. Are you guys ready? Are you ready for a contest? I want you to take a pen and a piece of paper, if you have one nearby. You could also use your phone if that's efficient for you. And I want you to, I'm gonna give you 4 minutes. I'm gonna time you on my phone. In the next 4 minutes, I want you all to get the names and an email from as many other people in this room as you can within 4 minutes. And I've done this before. If you sit at the table with your head down, you are very unlikely to win my contest. So, okay, 4 minutes, go. Okay, let's wind it down, people. Okay, Frank, who got up and moved around. Frank, how many people? Oh, excuse me, Al? Ed, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm usually pretty good at that. Ed, tell me how many people you managed to procure an email from. 7 people, okay. Who beat 7? Who beat 7? Okay, how many? 26, nicely done. What was your method?
Well, I just took photos of everybody else's long list.
Took photos of the, yeah, all right. As a knowledge management professional, you built it on the infrastructure of other people's effort. Well done. I've literally never heard someone do that before. Anybody beat 26? Yeah, awesome. 80? That's amazing. Tell me your method. This is awesome. Okay, I want to go all the way to the other end of the spectrum. Is there anybody here who only got 2 emails? You did, okay, great. Tell me your name. Walter, okay. Walter, you got 2. Okay, what were the conversations like with the 2 people you got them with?
Well, I was chatting to my coworker over here. And this Canon salesman over here.
Sure, okay.
At the table with me, this guy arrived
Awesome, awesome. But you didn't even manage to get his email. Okay.
I didn't feel motivated enough to get off my butt.
Sure. Been there, been there. Okay, so that was fun. So tell me a little bit about, I'm going to ask a pretty simple question. What does the energy feel like now in the room? Yeah, good. And where was the energy level, if we had like an elevator, where was the energy level when you guys came in and sat down? Yeah, it was lower. Thank you. So thank you for working with me on that. And the main point I want to make from that is that I had the power. I'm the CEO of this room for the next hour, right? I'm the boss. I had the ability to change the energy in the room by getting you guys all to do a behavior. And I'm also going to hypothesize that I got you to do the behavior because I grounded it in some assumptions I was making about your community that felt somewhat accurate and grounded. I'd done like a kind of quick diagnostic from my research before walking in. And I also presumed you guys all had an aspiration for being here that was shared and common. So I could have asked you to do something like, I could have tried to change the energy by asking you to like switch shoes with the person at the other side of the table or get up and do jumping jacks. And we've all been parts of rooms where people tried to sort of like manipulate in that way. I'm saying, and the point I want to make, and it's the main point I'd actually like you to walk away with today, the main point is that to try to get people to evolve in a certain direction, the key is choosing behaviors and being really selective about those behaviors and making people feel like they're not arbitrary, like those behaviors have been designed with that community in mind to help that community get somewhere that they all agree they're trying to get to. So that is the main model. I appointed myself CEO of this room like 5 minutes ago, you guys remember that. I'm asking why you should trust me as the CEO. That's because I run something called the Katzenbach Center within PwC. Jane mentioned this in her intro. The Katzenbach Center is within PricewaterhouseCoopers, huge. I'm sure many of you are familiar with PwC. The Katzenbach Center is a center of knowledge and excellence on topics like culture, leadership, and teaming. And I've been in this field for almost 20 years now and have come into this role through a series of different acquisitions. So I started in a small firm called Katzenbach Partners that was acquired into another firm that was acquired into PwC. My parents still think this is absolutely hilarious that this is what I do for a living. When I tell them I go in and advise CEOs on their cultures, they think that's hysterical. They say, what are you doing with your English PhD? Because that was what my original, and I'm sure a lot of you in this room, I'm sure I'm speaking to a lot of PhDs in this room, and does anyone here have a humanities PhD? Awesome, in what? Yeah, cool, awesome, oh great, let's talk about that later, that makes sense to me. So, but however, my career path does not make sense to my parents. They still make fun of me. But a friend of mine who is a cartoonist, I was recently telling him kind of like what my life looked like in my 20s when I was writing my literature PhD. And I was telling him some of the things that were important to me and what I like to do. And he put together this illustration that we're going to call graduate student Gretchen. And this is what I was like when I was in my 20s and pursuing a PhD. I loved these things. I was really passionate about number 2 pencils. I drank an obscene and probably unhealthy amount of coffee. I loved New York City architecture. I was a walking tour guide, was one of my side jobs while I was writing. And I was really interested in individuals and their relationship to culture. My dissertation, who here's read it? Just kidding. My dissertation was about women poets in Greenwich Village during the 1920s. And for me, that through line with what I've ended up doing, I was actually super interested in why were people who did a particular type of work attracted to a particular community? Like what was in the water was the question I was always asking myself, which to me is a very solid through line with that same cartoonist created what we will call CEO advisor Gretchen. So this is me now. Through miracles of modern makeup, I look exactly the same. But I also, some of these kind of characteristics of my professional identity have changed. I now am much more likely to be lying in bed at night reading behavioral economics than I am to be reading poetry. That's a huge shift. more interested in Starwood points than, which are now Marriott Bonvoy points, are they not? The point system is more familiar to me now than pencils, but I've retained I still drink a crazy amount of coffee, and I've retained a really core interest in this idea of individuals and their relationship to culture. I still wake up in the morning thinking, what's in the water? What's in the water that makes this company with people of the same sort of talents and skills just work better than this one where something's different? So I'm still interested in these questions, and part of the reason I make this point and sort of indulge myself with this little personal narrative is that you guys are willing to accept this story. You're willing to listen to me and let me be CEO of this room because that evolution was 20 years in the making, right? Like that gives me authenticity. If I told you that I was that graduate student 2 years ago, you certainly wouldn't believe me. Jane probably wouldn't have invited me here. And you also probably wouldn't be listening to me with the attention that I appreciate that you're giving to me right now. You wouldn't think I had anything to say because we all sort of tacitly assume it takes people time to evolve. I'm making that same argument about cultures, and you would be shocked how often we accept a person takes time to evolve, but frequently a leader, a CEO, the head of an enterprise risk management program will come to me and say, we're rolling out a new system in 6 months. We need the culture to change by then. Or our operating model goes live March 1st. We need to make sure we instill a performance culture by then. So that's the bad news about culture. Cultures do take a long time to change. Organizations have characteristics that are kind of dyed in the wool. The better news, like the kind of more positive news, is that you can accelerate how a culture evolves, and it is by a phrase I love, and it'll come back to it, it's by acting your way into new ways of thinking, right? It's by focusing on those behaviors first. If we think again about that, like Gretchen with the glasses to Gretchen in the suit, it was not sitting inside my head, and I was a thinker, right? Like I liked to be inside my head, but being inside my head was not what was going to get me from here to there, right? I had to do a series of actions, the kind of networking I just forced you guys through. I had to make a series of definitive actions, and doing those actions over and over time was my way of acting my way into this new way of thinking. So the main things I want to thank you for sort of having the patience to let me get through that story. Here's the things I want to tell you about today that I think I can convince you by the end of this hour, and I'll come back and ask you if I have. The first and main point that I've been trying to make through that exercise is that cultures evolve slowly, but that a practical and focused approach is what can accelerate that momentum. So it is possible to change a culture. They're not static. They're going to change anyway. The question is, how can you sort of steer that toward the objective of what you're trying to do? The second one is that culture is a source of energy and not a barrier to change. And that's the argument of the book that I've written. And it's the main mental flip that I usually make when I'm talking to a client about how to work with rather than against a culture. And it does require a mental flip, so we'll go through that. And then I also think, and I actually think this one, I really wanted to say this to you guys specifically. I think cultural wisdom or cultural intuition, I think understanding how cultures work is strategic thinking of the highest form. And I think as knowledge management professionals working with or within organizations, I think to be intuitive about culture and to understand that whatever you design needs to work with rather than against the way the culture tends to behave will be for you a source of power. And that's, I think you guys agree with me. I think that's why you're listening. But that's kind of my last hypothesis that I want to get through today. So talking to you a little bit about how we define culture. I know you guys are language people and interested. This idea that a culture is a self-sustaining pattern of behaving, feeling, thinking, and believing that determines how we do things around here is the working definition that my colleagues and I use, that we threw on paper 10 years ago and has proved good enough for what we say. The main things I want to point out about this definition, we think about culture as an ecosystem. Many things, like any kind of ecosystem, if one part moves, it has to influence the other parts as well. And it is how you think and how you feel. Culture is, Jane and I were talking about this over breakfast, culture is deeply emotional. Culture is deeply has to do with beliefs and mindsets and synapses in your brain and how they fire. But the practical focused approach that we talk about is let's focus on the behaviors. Let's make behaviors the focus of this kind of intervention, because I can look at you and I can say, this is what I observe. I observe that the person who won the networking exercise, well, the behavior of taking a snapshot of the picture from the back, but this is a behavior. I can say, this person was very successful at that networking exercise. Here's a behavior that can help all of you do more of that. Because it's specific, it can be called out. So that's why we focus on behaviors. There's also no perfect model. As I said before, there is no perfect framework for how we think about culture. But again, I think this one is really useful and more than good enough. And this framework argues that if an organization has its strategy, its operating model, and its culture, culture needs to not be the sort of lazy line at the bottom of the work plan. Culture needs to be understood as implicitly involved in these two other forces or systems. And I would argue that over time, I've worked for a long time with a man named John Katzenbach. Does anyone here heard of him or have read any of his works? Oh, good, thank you, I saw someone smile in the back. Awesome. So I'll talk a little bit more about who he is and I think why who he is should matter to you guys. But I've worked with him for a long time and I've seen him draw this image on like cocktail napkins for a CEO in a bar, on whiteboards, and it holds true and useful because basically what this means, my children understand this image, it makes sense. It's not complicated, but the thing that it's saying is if you try to make a decision about culture, if you try to make a decision about strategy and it's not a strategy that your culture is going to support, you maybe don't have the right strategy, right? And often a strategy changes, we make the operating model changes to try to make that strategy work. We want to be less siloed, we break those up, the org chart changes. The part about the culture also needs to be thought of as something that needs to be worked with rather than against to make that strategy work. So questions on that? Anyone? That makes sense to people, yeah? Okay, so basically I mentioned this before and asked you to put a pin in this idea. This was the idea. John Katzenbach and I did not say this. We actually just pulled it from someone else. But this idea that it is easier to act your way into new ways of thinking than it is to think your way into new ways of acting is the fundamental concept at the heart of our work and of the book that we wrote. The analogy I frequently make when I talk to leaders is that let's say you came to me and as any human living in a human adult body has, you're asking yourself the question, how can I live healthier? Right? Like you might come to me and say, what are the behaviors? You work with lots and lots of people. What are the behaviors I need to do to be healthier? I could not look at you and meet you and tell you. I would have to say those behaviors I need to start with like who you are. Do you travel a lot? Do you have children? Are you allergic to eggs? I would need to know certain fundamental things about you in order to be able to choose those. And I would also need to ask, healthy what for? Do you want to wear size 15? Do you want to be able to pick up your children when you're 80? Like what is the aspiration of that evolution? So that's kind of the breakthrough idea, or the idea at the heart of our book. This is the book that I wrote. I wrote it with my colleague, John Katzenbach. The book is called The Critical Few, and it was published in January of this year. And it took me and John Katzenbach, I actually want someone to guess, how many years? John Katzenbach we did a project together. It was working for General Motors during their turnaround, so actually I've given you a clue. We did a project at that time working with their interim CEO, Fritz Henderson, during their bankruptcy. And he said, I know I need to evolve the culture of General Motors in order to keep it running. In order to keep the lights on, I have to address culture, but I don't have time to do that slowly. What can we do? And this notion of being very focused and focusing on a critical few things sort of developed in the kind of like fire of that really dramatic time. If you had said to me, John Katzenbach then said, let's write a book about this. And I said, you can't write a book about one thing. You need to sort of prove it over time. But it took us then 7 years to write this book. And at first I was a little bit embarrassed of that. Obviously, as anyone, you also wrote a dissertation in rhetoric, as anyone knows, the shame of people asking you, are you done with your book yet, is a heavy burden. And in a business driven by quick quarterly targets, was there a lot of patience for me to continue working on this book over the side of my desk? No. But now I kind of brag about it having taken 7 years, because I actually think if I'm going to say to all of you professionals that cultures take time to evolve, that doing something meaningful with a culture takes time to evolve, I want to have written a book in which we have data that was built up over time as well. Right? And that's really where I think this book is quite different. John Katzenbach, I'll talk a little bit about him, but he's a bit of a guru in the field. He wrote a book called The Wisdom of Teams in the 90s that in a world where most business books within a year are not worth the paper they're printed on, I say this with great humility as someone who just wrote one, that book has been in print for 22 years. It was a groundbreaking work at the time that it was published on teams and how they function. And the argument of that book is actually quite interesting and relates to this book, and it's basically that there is no ideal form of a team. The way that teams need to work is by understanding the challenge in front of them and being able to form against those challenges. So that was the point of that book. That is why John Katzenbach's book name is in the very big font, and mine is in that very small font. But we went out in the world and we asked for endorsements. We felt good about the book. We asked a man named Edgar Schein to endorse the book, and he wrote a book called Organizational Culture and Leadership. He's an MIT emeritus professor and sort of the father of the field I'm in. And we also asked a man named Charles Duhigg, who's sort of a pop New York Times behavioral economist. He wrote a book called The Power of Habit and another book called Smarter, Faster, Better, and he's got a podcast he's sort of a disciple of like Stephen Levitt, and he's kind of so we asked kind of the grandfather of the field and kind of a newcomer in the field, vaguely of what we work in, and they both wrote very warm endorsements right away. So that's my humble brag, guys. We got really great endorsements. I was very proud of those. But I was also proud of the way the book was written. So here's his name in big font. Here's mine in little font, but I get to put it in big font because I'm speaking right now. And then, but what we put at the bottom of the book, and what John Katzenbach actually wanted not to have our names, but just to have the Katzenbach Center Community of Practice as the cover line, as the byline, which obviously the publishers did not want. But the book really was written, if any book in business can said to have been written collaboratively, it really was this one, because we wrote it by running this center within an organization, taking that project, saying to other partners we worked with, this seemed to work well, do more of it. We wrote it in this way. The research of the book was people trying these ideas in South Africa, in Spain, in Bogota, Colombia. It was like, let's take this idea and let's use it across industries. And so we were very proud of that like a community of practice wrote this book. And I also think that's why, as all of you people working in fields in which you're trying to get communities to work on and develop ideas together, I actually wanted to point this out about this book, because this book really is, collective product sort of built on other ideas. As I mentioned, John Katzenbach wrote this book called The Wisdom of Teams that some of you might be familiar with. John Katzenbach is known among other professionals who work with him for his habit of regular and non-aggressive exercise. So I point this out. I've worked with him for 15 years. He's now 87 years old, and he continues to travel and see clients and work and advise people and write. He lives in the mountains outside South Carolina, and he will ride his bike 20 miles, 30 miles at a time. And he will also, it's very hilly, and he will sometimes be like coming up, a bicyclist my age is going up a hill, and they will turn around and look back, and they will see this octogenarian lap them, which is funny, right? And then the secret to that is that he actually has underneath, is anyone here a biker? Yeah, so he's got underneath the seat of his bike, he has a little motor, and he can switch it on at will. And he's obviously very funny and likes the joke of this, and he loves to tell, he loves to sort of open a meeting telling this story. But what I realized one day is that the argument that we're trying to make about culture is the same as the analogy of the motor under his bike seat, which is this. Culture is a competitive source of energy. It is the thing about an organization that can't be copied. And if leveraged and used correctly, when you know how to use it, can give sort of acceleration and a tailwind to anything else you're trying to accomplish. So that was the next point I wanted to make about culture, that it's a source of energy rather than a barrier to change. And that's the flip I was talking about that I think is useful about our work. I think it is really easy to say, I am building a beautiful system, and the problem is that people won't use it. And I think to flip around and to think about, and I'm sure you all do, but there is, rather than thinking about a sort of ideal end user, to ask the question of how do people really work, and what motivates them, and what are the emotions that get in the way of them following a logical work plan and doing things the way that we think is the right way to do things, I think is the question that being intuitive about culture helps you ask, and why I think being intuitive about culture might help all of you be more successful. So that we know some of these things. The Katzenbach Center is a research institute, as well as I've described kind of my work with clients and the books that we wrote. We also do a global survey, and we've done it longitudinally every 4 years. Last year, we had 2,000 respondents in 50 countries and almost as many industries, asking them questions about culture. Some of the statistics I thought were most significant that came out of that this year, the last time we ran it, one was that 71% of C-suite and board members view culture as an important topic on the agenda of their company's leadership, and 65% of leaders agree that culture is more important than strategy and operating model. So that mattered to me when that came out of the data. We also saw out of that data that when we asked this question, so here that 71%, I'm only looking at among those 2,000 people who checked the box that said that they were C-suite or board, if I ask that same question, is culture on the agenda of the C-suite and the board? If I ask that question and then I look at the data for every respondent, including people who are middle managers and frontline, what would you guys guess that number goes from 71% to? Yeah, it goes down. It's 41%, which is a really interesting. So I think I took from that what I sort of know intuitively from my work with leaders over time. Leadership tends to take a much rosier view of a culture and of how things operate than people do within sort of the bowels of an organization. And that's important to know, because I think as people who are thinking about and designing systems that need to be used broadly across an organization, I think it's important to know that what the leaders believe about the way that culture behaves is not necessarily the way that a culture behaves, and that your job is probably to be smarter than the leadership is about what is real and what is accurate about how the culture works. So that's why I thought that would be useful. I want to tell you a story about how we worked with a client in South Africa, because I think it'll illustrate some of these points that I've been talking about. They were a bank with 30,000 employees. The year of this engagement was 2018. They were living in a world in 2018, as many organizations are, where, I mean, loosely, the term we used 5 years ago was big data, right? But it's still a real, they had much more information available down to the level of each individual customer about customers and the way they behaved than they'd had in 2008. And they made a huge investment in building a new system that could be used by all 30,000 employees that surfaced all those insights. So if I'm a customer, suddenly you know about me, why I use an ATM instead of going to a teller. You suddenly have all these insights on me as a customer that weren't available before. We did not do the implementation of that system. They actually came to us later. When they designed that implementation, they made a work plan that looked something like this. They were like, here's how the data's gonna work, here's how the production will work, and then here's that kind of culture at the bottom. And I said this before, you get where I'm going. I'm not bearing the lead here. The culture at the bottom of the work plan didn't work, right? They came to us and they said, We built this beautiful system and no one is using it. And we've spent all this money and we agree that the culture is a barrier and a culture is the problem, but we don't know why that is. And the analogy they said we feel like we gave people this beautiful new set of knives and we put it in a block on the kitchen counter and everyone keeps opening the drawer and using the rusty scissors. Is that for me? Everyone keeps opening the drawer and using the rusty scissors. So I loved that analogy because I think who hasn't been through a systems integration of any kind or tried to implement a system that people's preference and comfort and familiarity with rusty scissors was not a problem, right? Like that is such a common problem about trying to create some kind of change. And so the question is, why do people use the scissors, right? Like what is it that motivates people to stick with the scissors? And some of it, and it's actually easy to think this is the whole thing. Some of it is because all of us are lazy. Two things. One is that no new system is ever implemented like here's the day that you lock my kitchen drawer and give me the knives, right? Everything is always messy. And the other one is that, people are creatures of habit. But it's really easy to then be like, all right, those things are true. Let's give up, right? And that's the kind of like culture as a barrier frame that I'm trying to say, let's go beyond. So when we talked to them, we said, okay, you understand the culture as a barrier. Give us permission to go off and try to find what that means. Let's do focus groups, let's do interviews. We tried to plow in and really be like, what was the motivational factor? And it was really interesting, and it had to do with fear. And this is how it had to do with fear. In talking to a bank manager, he articulated it really precisely, and he said, I've built my entire marketing plans, all the investments that we're making were based on assumptions about customers that this data has proved wrong. I don't feel like I have the air cover to actually admit that to anybody. We have a culture here that we do not tolerate failure. We talk about it often. How are we supposed to? People were not comfortable. So that's really interesting, right? And you can work, if you're leaders, you can work with that. You can't work with people who are lazy, they won't use the knives, but you can work with people are afraid of what the data reveals. So what we did is we convinced the leaders, you need to go around and you need to talk, you need to go, the leaders showed up at the different branches and they told stories about their own personal failures. We were like, if you cannot model symbolically that it's okay to talk about failure, so we did that, the leaders did that, then we went around and talked again to branch managers. We said, how did that go? They said, it went well. We see where we're going here. It would have meant a lot more if when people came to the branches, they used our names and looked into our eyes. Isn't that amazing? It's just an amazing story. And why I tell you that story is because the leaders had to do those symbolic acts, right? The leaders had to walk around and talk about failure, but they couldn't do it just once, right? And every time they did it, they had to learn, how can I next time do it a little bit more effectively in a way that's going to show more of a connection. You can't just say, don't feel fear. Not demonstrating we're trying to change, let's not have a culture of fear, is not a one-time act. It is a repeated addressing and acknowledgement of people's emotions and humanity. So I think I like that story very much, and I think it's really useful that people love to blame systems, but that issues are almost always human, and that there are ways that you can have the right hard conversations at the right time, which is what evolving a culture is, right? The evolution of culture is about orchestrating and managing people to have the right hard conversations at the last time. So I want to make my last point, and then actually have a little bit of a discussion again. I think, how am I on time? I am good, okay, because I actually want to get some questions from you guys, so I just want to tell you one more story. A good friend of mine who I work with named Amanda started her career 10 years ago working in a technology startup in San Francisco. And you can picture it. It's 30 people. They're quite environmentally conscious. That's a core trait there because they're San Francisco tech people 10 years ago. So nobody uses paper coffee cups. There's a coffee machine. There is a little kitchenette, and there's a dishwasher. And they kind of have a system going that I use my coffee cup during the day, and at the end of the day, I stick it in the dishwasher, and at night somebody closes it, and the dishwasher the next morning is clean. The company is growing. It's San Francisco 10 years ago, tech startup. This is natural. The company is growing and more people are being hired and more coffee cups are purchased. And what do you think the kitchen starts to look like as we move from like 30 to 60? We've got a sink full of dirty coffee cups, right? The CEO is one day standing next to Amanda in the kitchen, and he looks at the dirty coffee cups, and he looks at Amanda, and he says, I think it's time we buy a second dishwasher. And Amanda laughed and laughs about this story, but we're like, that is the perfect metaphor for what happens so often. Leaders often come to us after they've bought a second dishwasher, because the purchase of a second dishwasher is like a classic error, right? Because it's like, we can just, as the system grows, we can just double the tech and it will work exactly the same. And what really needed to be done, right? The leaders needed to think about what are kind of the assumptions that people are making when they leave their coffee cup in the sink? Like, how can we change people's behaviors? And of course, I asked Amanda this, of course they bought a second dishwasher, and of course the coffee cup piles up, and of course it ended up being a really good conversation in that company about like how they grew and where that happened. But the question I actually wanted to ask you guys, I just heard this story the other day, and I thought for you guys it might be a good discussion item. The question is, what is the second dishwasher error you've seen in the world of knowledge management, that you've seen leaders make or that you yourselves have made? And do you believe that like cultural intuition or cultural wisdom could have prevented the metaphorical purchase of that second dishwasher? Does that question make sense to people? How much time have I got? 10 minutes? Actually, let's use that, since we've only got 10 minutes and I want to have time for questions, let's actually use kind of those questions as like a starting point for, I'm curious if this gets anyone to think about something that would be useful to share with other people in terms of like a second dishwasher. Or if you just have questions for me directly, that's fine also. I don't want to leave without giving you that chance. Yeah, so the question is, when you globalize a program across cultures, so you're asking me the question of like, let's call global culture with a big C. How does what I know about culture with a small c apply to when you're thinking about culture with a, yeah. So one of the things I know from, because I'm frequently working with global organizations trying to wrestle with that question, one of them is that it's easy to get distracted by big C culture, and it's important to remember that every organization has a way that it operates, that don't let the big C culture question distract you from asking the hard question of what's characteristic of our organization and how it operates, right? So one of them is like, don't let that be your sort of off the hook. And the second one is that, like, also you sort of need to think about, again, back to that like ecosystem model, you need to think about how, you know, if my organization is PwC, there are subcultural ecosystems within the Columbia PwC partnership firm, within the Canada PwC partnership firm, right? You are on the hook to understand the culture of the parent organization and what it has in common, and you're on the hook to understand how those things diverge. I'm not saying anything that profound, but the question is, you know, I think all culture work is deeply semantic. I think getting people to agree on what we're talking about when we're talking about culture at this company is semantic work. But I think being able to be clear that when we're talking about how we're planning something and being intuitive about how people will use it, that we're making that distinction. Yes?
To what extent is it possible to change culture, start the process without the C-suite support?
Excellent question. Yep, I think I'm steering the way that I talk toward that the C-suite needs to do it, because that's often my audience. But I absolutely believe that like leaders at all levels are accountable for culture. And that, I think if anything, an organization is, you know, a conglomeration of teams that act with and without consistency, right? Like an aligned culture is one in which teams tend to act kind of similarly around a set of traits. But I think it's absolutely possible with the same sort of cultural wisdom and intuition for how people behave, absolutely is possible to start to change culture from where you sit. I also think that if you can change culture from within you, where you sit, and if you have the strategic intuition I'm talking about at the end, to then say, this is an experiment, almost like in theory, charter schools and public school systems were supposed to be proof that kids could learn. You know what I mean? Like that poor kids could learn, right? They were supposed to be like a proof of concept. Like if you can make something change within an ecosystem, you can actually make an argument. This is possible at my company. Therefore, it should be possible in other parts of the company. Here's what I learned, and I can share that. I argue that's to the benefit of the whole organism of the company, and I argue for you that puts you in a position of power. That's what I think. Other questions? Yes?
You were talking about that company that had a culture of fear.
Yes.
And it's been my experience that a culture of fear is a culture of distrust.
For sure.
And, the employees assume management is lying to them.
Yes.
And has some evil plan and is out to get them.
Wait, don't they? Is that not our tacit assumption in the room? Yeah.
How do you address that?
Yeah, how do you address that? You address that, so one of the things is you address it by acknowledging it, hearing it, and looking for, again, behaviors first. Getting leaders to understand that they can only, first of all, they can't change everyone who believes that. You know, like there never will be a day that an organization doesn't have cynics who think that the leaders are evil, right? But that trying to focus on changing the point of view of the cynics who think leaders are evil is like pouring water into a bucket with holes, right? Like what you need to focus on is instead, what can we find that has happened well, that is a positive example that will demonstrate to people an opposite message, and how do we clearly articulate that? How do we get it to happen more often, more of the time? Does that make sense? It's a very sort of positivist argument, but that's what I think about like cynicism as a force and distrust. There is no stating new values that say that we trust each other is not going to change that. Like what's going to change that are, if I believe something, if I believe that the leaders of PwC are bad, and I see one thing that sort of like knocks me off that a little bit, and then I see two things, and then I see a third thing, I start to like change how I think, right? But it has to come from their behaviors. Not a magic answer and a slow one. Any other questions? Yes?
Have you walked into a company and told the CEO that you're the problem?
You ask a $1 billion question. You ask a $1 billion question. Do I believe that sometimes an entire culture is symptomatic of a pathological CEO? Yes, I do. Am I important enough to tell a CEO that? No, I am not. Would I like to be? Yes. In 10 years, maybe I would be able to do that. Do I think that? Yes. Do I think if you're telling me you work in an organization with a pathological CEO, that you are off the hook for any ability to change the culture? No. I think that in some ways that's the cultural condition of where you work. And I'm not saying your CEO is pathological, but just a hypothetical. Yeah, could be true. I think there are ways that, and I also do believe that it's possible by going, so let's say companies have called me where, two people in the C-suite are saying to me, we need help on the culture, and guess what? It's because the CEO is evil. Like, I'm willing, I do believe I can work on the culture in other ways, and that I can make things better for the people who work there through the method outlined in the book, bottom up. And I do believe that going at it that way might change the CEO's mind in a way that me telling him it's his fault. I am using he very consciously there, and it's interesting. Telling him it's his fault would be much less effective than over time trying to work. Yeah. Any other? Yes, please.
So you mentioned team.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question. Say that again.
Patriarchy.
Yes.
Is the question.
Patriarchy is the question. I mean, thank you for asking me that question. I did start my life as a feminist scholar. I'm also working in an organization that is looking to, I think diversity of organizations is, I think can say a couple different things, right? Like I think that diversity is a culture issue, right? Like I think anybody who's trying to go out into the world and help organizations develop more diversity needs to be thinking about it in the same, using what I know, that this notion that cultures are emotional, and I think there's been a lot of not effective, I think there's been a lot of dollars spent within organizations that is not effective in terms of trying to make diversity more prevalent because it's gone at it from mindsets rather than behaviors, right? I think that I think having people sit through implicit bias training is trying to go through mindsets rather than behaviors. So do I absolutely believe that the work of evolving cultures, I also say, and we say in the book, like, I'm not saying cultures are good or bad in this book. I'm not saying that cultures are good or bad. I'm saying let's figure out what this culture is so that you can work with it. So I'm not hypothesizing how to work on culture from a model of what a good culture looks like. Do I personally believe that that greater diversity in organizations will produce cultures that are more collaborative and have qualities of less hierarchy and people's emotional commitment to them that I think we all agree implicitly makes organizations run better? Yes. I haven't yet done that research or that work, but honestly, that's what I'd like to be talking to you about in 5 years or in a decade. Cool. Okay, I think I'll close there. I'll be outside and can answer some questions afterward. Thank you so much. This has been really fun.